Russia's military assault on Ukraine plows into a fourth week. How much longer can Ukrainians hold out?
Lots of parts of the city, it's destroyed like this. There are bodies everywhere.
VOA is on the ground after the bloodbath at Irpin and in Poland, where NATO forces are on high alert after Russia strikes short of the border. The appeal of Ukraine's president and remembering the journalists killed in the line of duty. Now, on the Inside Story, the battle for Ukraine.
Hi, I'm Carla Babb reporting from the Pentagon. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is in its third week. U.S. officials say military aid will continue from here in Washington and NATO, and that it will get to Ukrainian fighters. This comes as Russia has launched more than 900 cruise missiles into Ukraine. Now, I want to show you some of the footage our reporter in and around Kyiv, Jan Wojciech, filmed this week when one of those missile strikes hit an apartment building in the Ukrainian capital. 2 people died and many more were injured. Dozens of families' homes completely destroyed in the attack. Irpin has been the site of fierce battles between Ukraine and Russian forces.
I'm here in Irpin. This is the front line. You can see back in there's a big smoke column. The fight's going on there. The Russians are really close to here. These guys here, they were arrested by the Ukrainian army. They're being accused of being spies. This is how Irpin looks today. Lots of parts of the city, it's destroyed like this. There are bodies everywhere. I saw at least 5 bodies today. At this point, you can't tell who are they in, if they are civilians, if they are fighters, if they are Russians. It's difficult to tell.
Many have likened the fight for Ukraine to the biblical story of David, who slew the giant Goliath. The Goliath, Russia, has the world's second largest military with better equipment. But despite this, Ukraine has made a remarkable defensive stand. Experts say that is thanks in part to weapons supplied by the Pentagon and NATO.
I mean, in some ways it is a David-Goliath matchup, but, David had a rock, and Ukraine's got a lot of rocks.
Weapons potent enough to ground a Russian helicopter like this one seen in a video posted by the Ukrainian military. The fiery fall, a likely signature of a Stinger anti-aircraft missile.
So if you get a lot of these out there, you start having the ability to protect critical facilities and towns from drones and from helicopters that might be bringing in troops.
U.S. officials say allies have sent thousands of Stingers, heat-seeking missiles with a range of about 5 kilometers, small enough to carry on foot.
It's something you could hide in a place until it was time to fire.
Russia amassed up to 190,000 troops around Ukraine's borders before sending them in to battle Ukraine's some 170,000 troops, plus tens of thousands of reserves. But officials say hundreds of Moscow's T-90 and T-72B3M battle tanks have been taken out by these javelins.
They're anti-tank, anti-vehicle weapons that are heat-seeking, so you don't have to be sort of a sniper and get a precise target.
Part of what makes the javelin so good is the warhead. Okay, it's effective, and it has a top attack where it hits the top of the turret, which is the least protected part of any tank. It doesn't have to go through the front, which is the thickest part.
U.S. officials say they have sent more than 17,000 anti-tank weapons to Ukrainian forces during the first few days of the war, boosting the country's defensive capabilities.
I mean, when you fire it, then you can move. So it protects. The gunner is less vulnerable.
But Russia has its own effective firepower, firing hundreds of Iskander missiles with a range of 500 kilometers and Kalibr missiles with a range of up to even 5 times farther, an overwhelming advantage in the skies.
Russia has the ability to hit targets in western Ukraine all the way at Ukraine's border. And these are designed to take out big targets, to take out runways, to take out military bases and facilities.
These missiles launch from Russian ships at sea, bombers in the air, or from vehicles on the ground, and would complicate any effort to establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine, as Kyiv has repeatedly requested and the Biden administration has ruled out. But experts say these Russian missiles could be running low, and even though Moscow has more warplanes, Putin may be holding them back.
If Russian aircraft are heavily used and damaged in this fight, if they're expending all of your munitions, well, then they're potentially exposed in a potential conflict with NATO.
Russia stands accused of using cluster bombs, dumb bombs, or imprecise bombs, and even thermobaric weapons, despite an international ban on using them near civilian populations.
When a military gets stuck, they oftentimes resort to these sort of brutal, bloody tactics, and that's the Russian military. We've seen it.
All while officials say Russian troops face food and fuel shortages and stiff resistance from motivated Ukrainians.
The Russians are about 10 days from being able to continue what they're doing because they have manpower issues, serious troop morale, desertions, all these kind of things. The fact that they're asking for China for help, the fact they're asking Syrians to come in and fight, these are all indicators that they're in trouble, and they know it.
And there are reports that Ukraine now has S-300 missile defense systems, a critical and potentially game-changing weapon able to shoot Russian missiles out of the sky before they hit their targets. Over the weekend, Russian missiles hit a base near Poland's border, one used for years by U.S. and NATO forces to train Ukraine's troops. At least 35 people were killed, more than 130 injured in the attack in Yavoriv, 25 kilometers from Ukraine's border with Poland. VOA cameraman Mike Burke and I spent time there in 2015 covering U.S. forces training Ukrainians on marksmanship and first aid. The Pentagon says it does not view Russia's missile strike on the base as an effort to target U.S. weapons and aid to Ukraine. But with NATO troops deployed in the nearby forested mountains, the assault shows just how close we are to an accidental engagement between NATO and Russian forces. VOA's Henry Ridgewell has more from Arlemo, Poland.
Troops from the US 82nd Airborne Division on the march in the forests of Arlemov in Poland's Carpathian Mountains. The contingent is part of a wider deployment of 5,000 US troops sent to Poland in recent weeks. That's in addition to the 4,000 American soldiers already in the country. NATO is sending a message that they will defend every inch of alliance territory.
The Ukrainian border is just a few hundred meters down this track. And as thousands of American troops conduct exercises in these Polish forests, Russia has been conducting airstrikes on Ukrainian targets just over the frontier.
There are growing fears of an accidental engagement between the US and Russia. A hotline has been set up to avoid that scenario. But there are also fears that NATO troops in Eastern Europe could be targeted in the event of escalation. Russia's President Vladimir Putin last month raised the alert level of his nuclear forces in response to what he described as NATO's aggressive statements.
NATO still is saying that it will not intervene on Ukrainian territory, but increasingly Western weapons are flowing into Ukraine through NATO member states. And it is possible that Putin will, or in fact already sees, such military support, which it has to be said on our side is not particularly controlled or accompanied by careful messaging, as NATO joining the fight. In other words, the discussion to some degree is now about whether Putin would be willing to use tactical nuclear weapons against NATO forces on NATO territory. that would be a new world.
The alliance must not let Putin get away with nuclear blackmail, says Fabrice Potier, a former head of policy planning at NATO.
What will stop Putin from doing the same next time, possibly including against a NATO ally?
NATO has repeatedly said it will not get directly involved in the conflict. Potier says the alliance should do more.
Are we fully aware of the danger of not doing anything? If I look at that recent history, actually the risk of standing on the sideline and clamoring that we are covering the NATO allies back, but our mission stops at the NATO border, that I think risk is no longer acceptable.
Ukraine's border with Poland has become the major gateway for refugees fleeing the conflict. But it is also becoming a key strategic frontier, a conduit for NATO weapons heading into Ukraine and a potential future flashpoint.
For decades, Ukraine has acted as an effective buffer zone between NATO and Russia. But if the Kremlin's forces seize all of Ukraine, there is little to separate NATO troops and Russian soldiers. There is no border fence here, just mountains and forests. Henry Ridgewell for VOA News, Arlemov on the Polish-Ukraine border.
From Moscow to Berlin and here in the United States, protests continue calling for an end to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. With the anti-war sentiment rising, acts of vandalism are starting to affect Russian-owned businesses here in the United States. VOA's Vero Balderas has more.
Thousands have rallied in New York City in support of Ukraine since the start of the Russian invasion. Russian immigrant Sasha Natsintseva had felt welcome to join in at first.
I overheard some American guys behind me saying not very good things about Russians. They got a little aggressive. They said some nasty things to me. And there were another two Ukrainian people who I heard them saying go back to Russia.
Her case is not unusual, as opposition against Moscow's actions is manifesting itself against Russians in the U.S. In Washington, D.C., the Russia House restaurant, for instance, was reportedly vandalized. It's the cancel culture hitting Russian businesses, says Mikhail Podolsky, who was born and raised in Moscow.
Stores try to get rid of the Russian vodka. Online communities, they change Russian group to Russian-speaking group. Russian stores, they remove signs that it's Russian, just, I guess, to keep themselves safe.
Yulia Luzhnikova hopes the animosity doesn't get worse.
It's very sad that this is happening. People are people. I don't think we need to generalize just by someone having a Russian surname that becomes an enemy.
The Russian diaspora is working to raise awareness and put pressure on Moscow to end the war, says Natalia Arno, president of the Free Russia Foundation, which advocates for a free, democratic Russia.
We are organizing a huge information campaign to tell the truth so that these exiled Russians can target those who are in country and send them the truth, send them photos, send them videos.
The message seems to be getting across. Protesters have taken to the streets in Russia, despite facing arrest and years in prison. Peter Litsky, who was born in Moscow, worries that tough American and European sanctions will undermine change in Russia.
The people are becoming more poor, they are concentrated on their survival, they will probably not have time to work around changing the political system.
Marina Du has relatives in both Russia and Ukraine. She understands the negative perceptions some have of Russians these days. But it's time, she says, to come together and end the senseless suffering of war for both sides.
I'm just hoping that people will not escalate this hate, not provoke hate towards each other, but just unite our, so every effort we can do to support people in Ukraine and in Russia.
VOA reached out to several Russians in the U.S. who support the invasion of Ukraine, but they declined to be interviewed. Veronica Valderas Iglesias for VOA News, Alexandria, Virginia.
Russia's attack on Ukraine has united Americans across the political spectrum, which has been rare in recent years. Polls show Americans favor economic sanctions against Russia's oil industry, even if it means higher prices at the pump. A bipartisan delegation of U.S. senators flew to Poland for a first-hand look at the situation. They told VOA's Miroslava Gangadze the need is dire. Members of Congress heard an appeal for help from Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy.
Is this a lot to ask for, to create a no-fly zone over Ukraine to save people? Is this too much to ask? Humanitarian no-fly zone, something that that Russia would not be able to terrorize our free cities. If this is too much to ask, we offer an alternative. You know what kind of defense systems we need, S-300 and other similar systems. You know how much depends on the battlefield, on the ability to use aircraft, powerful, strong aviation to protect our people, our freedom, our land, aircraft that can help Ukraine, help Europe. And you know that they exist and you have them, but they are on Earth, not in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian sky.
He remains in Kyiv, addressing his citizens and leaders from other countries, and even visiting wounded soldiers and walking around outside in the beleaguered capital city. He is admired around the world for his resilience against Vladimir Putin. So, who is Volodymyr Zelenskyy?
In the days since Russian forces invaded his country, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has become an admired major figure on the world stage. As tens of thousands of Russian troops converge on Kyiv and Ukrainian authorities report a foiled Russian plot to assassinate him, Zelenskyy has vowed to remain in Ukraine's capital city. He has led Ukraine's resistance against the invasion through video addresses delivered from the streets of Ukraine's threatened capital and from his calls on the European Union and other international bodies for financial and military support. Until recently, the 44-year-old former actor and comedian was not well known outside of his native country. He took office in spring 2019 with 73% of the vote, defeating former President Petro Poroshenko. His election was a case of life imitating art. Prior to the election, he was best known for playing a high school history teacher in the hit satirical television show Servant of the People. In it, he skyrocketed to fame and was elected president of Ukraine after a viral video captured him ranting against widespread corruption. In 2018, Zelenskyy was nominated by a newly formed political party named after the TV show to run on an anti-corruption platform, similar to that of his fictional character. For many Americans, their first introduction to Zelenskyy came in 2019, when he was pressured by then-President Donald Trump to dig up dirt on former Vice President and presidential candidate Joe Biden and his son Hunter. Zelenskyy was born in Kryvyi Rih, a city in a Russian-speaking region of south-central Ukraine, which at the time was part of the Soviet Union. Zelenskyy, who is Jewish, has said that his extended family suffered severely during the Holocaust. His grandfather, who lost his own father and 3 brothers to the Nazis, served in the Red Army during World War II. Zelenskyy married screenwriter Olena Kiashkow in 2003, and they have a 17-year-old daughter and an 8-year-old son. All 3 are believed to be in Kyiv with Zelenskyy. He received a law degree from what is now Kryvyi Rih National University. But rather than pursue a legal career, he worked in comedy and was one of the founders of Curvetel 95, which became a successful television production company. Among his more unusual accomplishments was his victory in 2006 in the Ukrainian version of the television program Dancing with the Stars. Between 2009 and 2018, he starred in a number of films, primarily romantic comedies. When Zelenskyy took office in 2019, his country was already 5 years into a low-level conflict with separatist militias in Luhansk and Donetsk, two provinces that make up a region commonly known as the Donbass. The militias, with support from Russia, controlled portions of both provinces and frequently traded fire with Ukrainian troops. In addition, Russia remained in disputed possession of Crimea, which it seized in 2014 and claims to have annexed as part of Russia. Despite the worldwide support Zelenskyy enjoys today, his popularity had faded considerably among Ukrainians in the years following his election. In a country where corruption remained a major problem, he was seen as having done little to keep his promises about bringing integrity to the country's politics. In January, polls showed that only 30% of the population supported him. In the weeks leading up to the invasion, Zelenskyy displayed an unwillingness to believe U.S. intelligence reports that Russian President Vladimir Putin was determined to invade Ukraine. He frequently met U.S. warnings of an imminent invasion with public expressions of disbelief and even ridicule, while also trying to build support among leaders in Europe and around the world, hoping to pressure Putin to pull back troops. Critics have said that his frequent insistence that Putin was bluffing may have left his citizens less prepared than they might have been if he had taken the warnings seriously. But his rallying cry to fellow Ukrainians to stand up to Russian aggression has won support around the world. He's now seen by Ukrainians and many others as servant of the people in his new role as a wartime leader.
Нашу державу. І так буде й далі. Слава нашим захисникам, слава нашим захисницям. Слава Україні!
An enduring legacy of this war will be how it is tearing at the fabric of Ukrainian society and Ukrainian families. And if you've ever been a pet owner like I have, you'll know that for some families, that extends to their animals. VOA's Celia Mendoza is with refugees and their four-legged family members in Przemysl, Poland.
3-year-old Puma belongs to Irina Borgodova. She's one of thousands of pets in Ukraine that, like their owners, are looking for a safe place. The Russians attacked her home in Kyiv.
I live my life, my friends, my business, my home, and my dog live her friends too. It's terrible, and it should be not.
Irina Borgodova waits at the Przemysl train station to board a train to her final destination. As of now, Tallinn, Estonia. Moving pets across multiple borders can be challenging due to regulations in each country. Many require them to be vaccinated and microchipped. The International Fund for Animal Welfare says that in the face of this crisis, Belgium, Switzerland, and France, among others, are making exceptions.
He's coming with me. I cannot leave him. He's my son. You cannot abandon your dog in any way.
Amid all the uncertainty, some refugees say escaping with their pets is helping them get through these traumatic times. Celia Mendoza, VOA News, Przemysl, Poland.
Before we go, a moment to cover 2 American journalists killed covering the war. Fox News cameraman Pierre Zarchevsky was outside of Kyiv when their vehicle was hit by incoming fire on March 14th. He was 55 years old. His colleague, correspondent Benjamin Hall, was injured and hospitalized. An award-winning filmmaker and documentarian Brent Renaud was in Ukraine working on a project spotlighting the global refugee crisis. He was killed on March 13th when Russian troops shot at his car at a checkpoint in Irpin, Ukraine. My colleague Miroslava Gangadze said Renaud cared about people and truth. He was 50 years old. That's all the time we have for now. Stay up to date at voanews.com and connect with us at VOA News on Instagram and Facebook. You can find me on Twitter at CarlaBabVOA. See you next week for The Inside Story.